1916, he wrote this song that we now have put lyrics to and made a Christmas song, but that's not what it was about. The interesting thing is that he wrote it in 1916, and the Ukrainian National Chorus brought it to the United States in 1922. But it's kind of interesting because what happened between 1916 and 1922? Well, you had the Russian Revolution in 1917, right? And you also had Ukraine declaring its independence from Tsarist Russia. It had always been part of Russia. And then when the Bolsheviks took out the Tsar, the Romanov family, they thought, now is our move. Now is our time to make a move. So they made a move for independence. And part of their move was kind of like what we see with Zelensky now. They had a tour. They went on an international tour with a Ukrainian National Chorus. Everywhere they went, they stressed that they had their own culture, that they were their own people, even though the New York Times and other people continued to call them Russians. Really great against them. They would hand out cards and tell, we're not Russians, we're Ukrainians, and all this sort of stuff. So it was a big PR tour to try to support the their nationalism. So they come to America. They perform in Carnegie Hall. Actually, it was in October. And by Christmas time, the Russians had brought them back in to the Soviet Union. That was 1922 that they originally did it. A century later, they come to Carnegie Hall and perform it again. Look, I understand the Ukrainians wanting to have their own culture, their own self-determination, and I supported that. I always do. I always support independence and self-governance. Of course, there's usually something else happening with these coups that involves the CIA, as we saw in this particular one. But they have the right to self-determination, and I support their independence from Russia if that's what they want. By the same token, the people in Crimea and the people in Donbass also have a right to associate with who they wish and self-determination and to stay with Russia if they wish. And I've pointed this out many times. I said, if you go back to our history of secession, the American Revolution was a war of secession, declaring independence from Great Britain and our self-governance. The Civil War, as it's commonly called, was the Second War of Independence. It was a war of secession and self-governance. It was not an attempt by the southern states to take over the entire United States. It was not a civil war in that response. It was a war of secession. And so when Virginia seceded, you had Western Virginia. The people there wanted to continue with the Union. And so the people in Virginia said, you have a right to secede, you have a right to secession. And so they agreed to that. They had to, essentially, to be consistent. But whether they liked it or not, they had to agree to that to support that principle, which was the principle that established both America and the principle that they were applying to for their independence. And yet, we see this over and over again, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere. Now, we're going to determine whether or not these people have the right to secede or not, depending on geopolitics, who is our ally, what do we want to see from the outcome. The principles of self-governance are not there. If they were, if the Ukrainians really believed that, they would have allowed Donbass to go their way instead of shelling them for the last 8 years, and Crimea as well. And there would have been peace. So three different versions. The first one done in 1916, and introduced into America in 1922. And then the other lyrics got very popular in 1936, about 14 years later. And then in 1947, the lyrics that you hear there. It's an interesting song. Began as a celebration of a pagan New Year, talking about what's happening in spring, because that was when the pagan New Year was. Then because of a political tour, very much like the one that's going on right now with the Ukrainian choir, as well as Zelensky, international tour, while you had the Bolshevik Red Terror was happening, pushed the idea of Ukrainian independence, and then it became an American secular Christmas song, then a religious Christmas song. But I think an even better story of Christmas time is the Christmas Truce. And we all know about that. The first year of World War I. The war had only been going on for a few months. It went on for many years after that. But I'm sure you all know the story. It's been put into one movie after the other, as well as there's even been songs written about it. It's been celebrated in so many different ways. But the British and their trenches heard late at night Germans singing. Some of them, they were singing Christmas carols like Silent Night. And so they sang along with them. And then they started shouting back and forth. Some of them, spoke English. Some of them spoke German. So they started communicating. They said, let's meet in the middle. Come on over here. Well, I'm not going to do that, but I'll meet you in the middle. So they met in no man's land, where they had been, the area between the trenches where they had been fighting each other. And it's known as the Christmas Truce. One British machine gunner, Bruce Bairnsfather, later a prominent cartoonist, wrote about it in his memoirs. He said, "Here I was in this horrible clay cavity, a trench, miles and miles from home, cold, wet through, and covered with mud. There didn't seem to be the slightest chance of leaving, except in an ambulance," he said. And then about 10 p.m., he heard a noise. He said, "I listened, and I said, 'Do you hear the Germans kicking up a racket over there?' 'Yes,' said my friend. He says, 'they've been doing it for some time. They were singing Christmas carols.' So some of the British soldiers began to sing back. He said, 'Suddenly we heard confused shouting from the other side. We all stopped to listen. The shout came again. The voice was from an enemy soldier speaking in English, but with a strong German accent. He was saying, "Come over here." One of the British sergeants answered, "You come halfway and I'll come halfway." And so what happened next was something that would stun the world, make history, as they got together and created their own truce. And it began to spread down the Western Front. A lot of interesting individual approaches, but I think the most interesting thing is that it spread. The war had only been going for 6 months. It went into a stalemate. The Industrial Revolution allowed wholesale murder. It went on for many, many years. And but starting after 6 months after the war had broken out, on Christmas Eve, small pockets of French, German, Belgian, and British troops had impromptu ceasefires all along the Western Front. He said, "I couldn't believe my eyes," he said when he got out of the thing. Here they were, the actual practical soldiers of the German army. And there wasn't an atom of hate on either side. They traded songs, they traded tobacco, they traded wine. Another soldier, a rifleman, wrote home a letter to his wife describing what happened. He said, "My company happened to be in the firing line on Christmas Eve. It was my turn to go into a ruined house and remain there until 6:30 on Christmas morning. During the early part of the morning, the Germans started singing and shouting, all in good English, and they shouted out, 'Are you the rifle brigade? Have you a spare bottle? If so, we will come halfway and you come the other half.' Later on in the day, they came toward us, and our chaps went out to meet them. I shook hands with some of them. They gave us cigarettes and cigars. We did not fire that day. Everything was so quiet, it seemed like a dream." Another British soldier, John Ferguson, recalled it this way: "Here we were laughing and chatting to men whom only a few hours before we were trying to kill." Other diaries and letters describe German soldiers using candles to light Christmas trees around their trenches. One German infantryman described how a British soldier set up a makeshift barber shop, charging Germans a few cigarettes each for a haircut. One account describes vivid scenes of men helping enemy soldiers to collect their dead, of which there were many. They even played European football. Just how many soldiers participated in this informal holiday gathering has been debated. There's no way to know, since it was unofficial as a ceasefire. And they were all small scale. They were all haphazard. But it just grew. And that's what scared the politicians. Some people estimate, on the 100th anniversary, Time magazine claimed that as many as 100,000 took part in this. And the high command on both sides was furious. We want you killing each other. You understand? They want us killing each other. That's why we don't want to put people into groups. That's why we don't want to do what the left does. That's why we don't want to do what Trump does. We don't want to divide people by politics, by skin color, by ethnic origin, all the rest of the stuff, because that's how they kill us. This is an outbreak of what Christ came for. To heal things, to unify us. Because there is no, there's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no male, female, bond, slave. We're all of one blood. We're all descended from Adam, descended from Noah. We all stand in need of God and forgiveness because each of us has gone his own way. Each of us, like sheep, have gone astray, as Isaiah said. And so, if we understand our position before God, if we understand that each of us is created in the image of God with inalienable rights, and that the purpose of government is not to gain territory. The purpose of government is not to make politicians more powerful, rich men richer. The purpose of government is to defend our liberties. So when the truce broke out, the leaders of all the armies were horrified. British General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien wrote in a confidential memorandum, "This is only illustrative of the apathetic state that we're gradually sinking into. We cannot have people fraternizing with the enemy, realizing that humanity is a fraternity, a brotherhood. We have to focus on our differences to the extent of killing each other." For the rest of the World War I, they would wind up having 15 million people killed. No more truces. They made examples of commanding officers. But it reminded, as History.com says, it reminded all those involved that wars were fought not by forces, but by human beings. And so we've had artwork, we've had made-for-TV movies, we've had songs, as I said before, all these things written to commemorate it. The guy that I first talked about, Bruce Bairn's father, he said, looking back on it all, I wouldn't have missed that unique and weird Christmas day for anything. So yeah, we have to transcend these political elite who use us as cannon fodder, who seek to slaughter and to enslave us, whether it's in a smart city or whether it's in a war, to satisfy their narcissism, their ambition. And we have to understand, as we see from just a humanistic side, a momentary pause in this Milgram experiment, where you will kill people if somebody in authority tells you to kill people. I was just following orders, right? There's also a moment when we could get a glimpse of the King of Kings and the Peace and Prince of Peace, and maybe we can follow him instead. The common man. They created Common Core to dumb down our children. They created Common Pass to track and control us. Their Commons Project to make sure the commoners own nothing. And the communist future. They see the common man as simple, unsophisticated, ordinary. But each of us has worth and dignity created in the image of God. That is what we have in common. That is what they want to take away. Their most powerful weapons are isolation, deception, intimidation. They desire to know everything about us while they hide everything from us. It's time to turn that around and expose what they want to hide. please share the information and links you'll find at thedavidknightshow.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. If you can't support us financially, please keep us in your prayers. thedavidknightshow.com.